Ladies and gentlemen, as a notorious optimist, I normally follow the good old Monty Python rule to always look on the bright side of life. But as we talk about global media, this is not always as easy. Quality journalism is becoming increasingly difficult to implement. Sometimes that's due to a lack of knowledge about the standards of the craft, but frequently the reasons behind journalistic impoverishment are political. Freedom of the press and freedom of expression are under huge pressure in many countries. For journalists, it becomes increasingly dangerous to investigate, report, in short, to speak the truth. More and more colleagues are paying with their lives for exercising their job and this human right. Freedom of information is also steadily being eroded. People are prevented from accessing independent information. Site blocking and censorship are sad realities in many countries. International broadcasters controlled by non-democratic regimes are ramping up. At the same time, we are witnessing a renaissance of cynical propaganda, disinformation, and media degradation, as the older generations among us might recall from Cold War days. Ladies and gentlemen, sadly, an overwhelming majority of the world's population lives without a free press, without free access to information, without the right to freedom of opinion. Prosperity has grown, freedom, unfortunately, hasn't. So, after all this sad news, how do we respond to that? Throughout the world, the struggle for freedom of expression has grown tougher. As a democratic nation in the heart of Europe, we want European values to be more widely perceptible. The launch of our English TV service is an important step in that direction. Ladies and gentlemen, like you, I'm looking forward to an interesting Congress, to meet interesting people and discuss fascinating topics. And I wish you good debates, many new ideas, and also a lot of fun with the Global Media Forum. Thank you.
Democratization of the digital arena, the imposition of fundamental democratic rights in the internet, from my point of view, that is the fundamental political challenge in our digital age society. The values we think are constitutive for our democracy in the analog world have to be preserved in the digital world and have to be defended there. And this results in a political and also cultural and media policy task. Ladies and gentlemen, the most important instances of democratic control are the independent media. This is why media quality and diversity are essential in the digital age. And luckily, there are media companies, director generals, etc., who search for rules with all their might in order to maintain quality and diversity in the media and to safeguard the freedom of the press in the world. Deutsche Welle makes a very important contribution, has made a contribution for more than 60 years, and against the backdrop of a large number of crises, and in spite of massive Russian non-information in the Baltic state, the work of Deutsche Welle is more important than ever before. We are lucky to have you. Deutsche Welle represents freedom of the press, human rights, democracy, and last but not least, it represents a societal model that is so attractive that it serves as an orientation for the market economy. It's an ambassador of our democratic rule of law, particularly in regions of crisis and in states that are governed in an authoritarian way. It's like a link to the free world for many people. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a lot of success for your conference and a little consensus, but lots of debates with results and findings on foreign policy and international democracy in the digital age. Thank you very much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As we all know, Deutsche Welle, DW, is an institution for public service broadcasting. And on this basis, its key performing elements are independent journalism and a determined focus on quality program. From now on, these ambitious commitments are also expressed with a new claim that you can read behind me on the wall, made for minds. I think that this claim is one of the best that has been created so far in our German media industry, and it is certainly the best to underline the genuine duties of public service broadcasting, namely to address the minds of the audience and not the cheapest and lowest common denominator of mass entertainment. There is absolutely nothing to say against mass entertainment. This is a natural and legitimate function of a free media market. But this is not the job of public service television or broadcasting. Public service broadcasting has the unique privilege of being financed by public fees. And in return, it has to create a sustainable programming for information, culture, and education. I think that DW, Deutsche Welle, fulfills this commitment with its current programming, and especially now with its enhanced programming, better than most of the other colleagues of public service television. DW, Deutsche Welle is a well-managed, modern media company, solidly financed. And so I tell to the management and to the journalists and the editors of Deutsche Welle, there are no more excuses. Now you have to perform your program in a quality that matches your great claim, made for minds. And I wish you all the best for this important job.
Georg Kuffler. The pressure's on public broadcasting after that to measure up in this international age. Director General Limburg, it's almost time. DW's new international news channel.
This is DW News live from Berlin. It's the day of reckoning for Greece. Can Athens reach a deal with its creditors? While Greeks rally in the capital ahead of an emergency summit of Eurozone leaders.
DW live from Berlin, the new DW News program. Well done, DW, and all the best in the future. A big hand as well for Commissioner Monika Grutas, Director General Peter Limburg, for answering our questions and talking to us today. Well, it's time to hand over now to my anchor colleague, Christopher Springgate, who's been working on a very big topic that's going to play a central role at this global media forum. He'll be guiding you through the next segment, starting with that age-old question, when it bleeds, it leads. Christopher, it's an incredible claim. When it bleeds, it leads. It's difficult for many of us. It seems it's bleeding more now than ever before. Is that claim still justified?
Well, I think it is. I mean, this is what we're going to be discussing with my panelists, which I'll be introducing in a short while. I think it probably is still valid as long as our coverage is balanced, as long as our coverage is accurate, and particularly important, as long as our coverage is representative of reality. There are many realities in this room. Ladies and gentlemen, if it bleeds, it leads. Foreign policy and international crisis reporting, that is now the issue at hand. You can see for my panelists, the chairs and tables are being put together. Let me just point to this young gentleman over there. His name is Yakov Leon, and you see he has his laptop open. He is reading your tweets Please do take your seats. I think we all have some water. Your microphones are there.
My phone's ringing.
Richard's phone is ringing. I did tell you he's very senior at BBC, so...
Sorry.
No, if it bleeds, it leads. Is that still a valid way or the best way of selecting international news?
Well, it's a very simplified way of describing the issue for what is a very complicated, increasingly complicated world. So I kind of think if you want a simple, short answer to a very simple question, it's no. But maybe I should expand upon that a bit. I do think that, I mean, of course, there's always been truth in the line, and when you simplify things in that way, it's always based on some element of truth. But I don't think that, I don't think it's anything like as simple as that. I think that for me, implies somehow or other that what we do is simply about ratings, about that is above everything, that the first thing we must do is get the greatest number of people to watch, and a greater number of people than somebody else. And I don't actually think that's the motivation, certainly not the motivation for what we do in the BBC. But as I say, we are an increasingly complicated world, complicated because of the stories we cover, big, globalized stories where it seems that every big issue stretches way beyond the borders of the story itself, where it starts from, and I think that poses a challenge for us. Complicated by all the things we've heard about so far this morning in terms of the way that the media is changing, the fact that the audience is as capable of producing news as all of the media organizations themselves.
Richard, so in other words, if it bleeds, it leads, still valid, but one of many criteria is what I get out of that in a very complex world. I'd like to bring in Anika. What are the decision-making structures at the EBU? Do you lead on the bleeding?
Well, we represent organizations like the BBC and Deutsche Welle. We represent 74 media organizations, mainly public service, across 56 countries. So it covers quite a large proportion of the media organizations that affect Europe. We don't choose the stories ourselves. They're chosen by the organizations that we represent. So yes, there is an editorial choice and there is an editorial part of what we are doing in the EBU, but we are not producing mainly for the public. But
you do see the choosing that other people are doing.
We do.
What do they use to guide that choosing?
We do every day, and my simple answer to this question would also be exactly the same as the BBC's. No.
Let me ask Katrin at this point. You're often where it's bleeding. Does that mean you have no problems getting your stories at the top of the news? And do you think that's right?
Well, I think sometimes it is right, sometimes it's not. So I would say yes and no to this, sentence: when it bleeds, it leads. If you take the conflicts, today's conflicts, that's the best example you could give. I mean, there's a lot of coverage of, the crisis in Ukraine, for example, whereas, some of the conflicts are becoming so dangerous and so bloody that there is no more coverage at all. And that might not just be an editorial decision. I would say, that's, something that is the result of the fact that the world is becoming more and more complicated. And, if you ask me, it's becoming more and more dangerous. So, yes, some conflict stories, some, tragic events, some natural disasters, would always lead the news if they happen, or in most of the parts of the world. When it comes to armed conflict, we didn't have reporters in Mosul, not only German media, I think most of the world media didn't have reporters in Mosul or places like Raqqa. We don't really know what's going on, in this Islamic State, in the so-called Islamic State. We don't actually know what, the people of Daesh are thinking and, why people would be joining them. All these are unanswered questions, and there's certainly no doubt that the conflict in Syria is a very, very bloody one, and it doesn't really get coverage.
Okay, thank you for that, Katrin. Let me bring in Andreas at this point. Catherine, you're sort of a contrast in a sense to Catherine. Catherine's been sort of at the sharp end of many conflicts. You're at the diplomatic end in Geneva or in New York, where the UN is discussing these issues. Do you find that if it bleeds, it leads, gets in the way of what you're trying to inform us about?
Yes, it more and more often does, and I want a little bit take on Richard's first remarks, because I think he painted a too positive picture, which might be true for the BBC, or at least for some programs of the BBC, but it's not true for the whole global media reality. I think we do have a rat race, which is a rat race among competing media, especially the electronic media, to a lesser degree the print media. And the issue is who is first with the most spectacular news, and the most spectacular news are mostly violent conflict, blood, etc. And that makes it much more difficult for journalists to cover the very, very dreadful often efforts to maybe de-escalate or even solve a conflict on a diplomatic level to get into the news. I think the rat race is not, unfortunately, about who delivers the best analysis, the best in-depth information, and the best enlightenment for the people. One of the most striking examples for me was the reporting about the Egyptian Arab Spring. For 3 weeks in a row, we had every night impressive pictures from the Tahrir Square in Cairo with 300,000 people demonstrating, and some young Egyptians being able in perfect English to explain to us in 10 sentences about what it was all about. And then Mubarak was gone, and 5 weeks later elections, and everybody was not only surprised but shocked that the Muslim Brotherhood wins 47% and the more radical Salafist Union another 26%, which is altogether a two-thirds majority. Why were we all surprised? Because nobody went outside the center of Cairo in these 3 weeks. You could have learned already by going to the slums of Cairo or by going further into the countryside that people are much more conservative, politically, religiously, culturally, and there the Muslim Brotherhood got 90% in some districts. Yeah, so we all, and something similar happened with us, all of us covering what happened on the Maidan in January, February last year. Nobody went out to the east at this time, trying to sense out what do the people in the eastern parts of Ukraine think about all this. We only did it when the war started there. Yeah? So I think we have huge problems, and we should devote some time of our discussion about how we get out of that. Whether there is a possibility in the context of the technological realities Richard described, whether there is a possibility. My answer is yes, but I think we should discuss that later.
Max, what Andreas was saying there, you know, we're in Cairo, we're in Kiev, but we're not looking beyond the capitals. Is that something that you've experienced as well? You've been in Washington, you're in Brussels, Berlin. Are we too focused on these capitals?
Well, I can say for Europe and the US, we did go beyond the capitals, definitely. Even, I mean, in the US, that was probably most of what we're doing. It depends on access, you know. The question is, where do you have the most access? As a foreign correspondent, as a German foreign correspondent, for example, in the US, you don't really have that much access at the White House. Even the German correspondents who sit at the White House press conference every day, they don't get an interview with Obama because the politicians there, and especially the White House, says, okay, what's in it for us? So you go beyond the capital. You try to tell the stories about gun control, about, or not, about abortion, and talk to the people. For that, it's a fantastic country. Here in Europe, it's a different story. In Brussels, you have a lot of access to decision makers, so you try to cover that more. And then, of course, there's the security situation also. I mean, I know all the stories, and Catherine obviously knows that a lot better than I do. In Baghdad, most of the journalists, they just sit in their hotels, and they have the stringers and the cameramen who go out, the Iraqis who go out there and do the actual work. So it's a security question as well. For Europe, I would say, no, you know, we're not just in the capitals. We go out of the capitals. In the US, that was true too. But I would like to add something to what Andreas said earlier, because I had the same initial reaction to what Richard said. in the beginning, and in my head it was like, yeah, sure, BBC, you can do that, you know, you can ignore things, which you don't, I think so, but a story like Charlie Hebdo, for example, or Germanwings, obviously the BBC is there too, but I do agree, especially if you work for live TV these days, you have to be there fast, because that's, for some people, especially the younger generations, that's the main reason why they're still watching TV. If you're there with a live satellite connection, then that's the moment, and something is actually happening at that moment. That's the moment where most people watch, because that's where they get the fastest reaction to what's happened, even faster maybe than Twitter or the more complete picture. That's why people still are watching live sports, for example, why that's a stronghold of TV. So I do believe as a live TV station, you have to be there, you have to try to be there quick, especially in those cases. The question is, what do you do then? Do you just describe, you know, what you're seeing, same thing over and over again, or do you really try to put it into context, paint a bigger picture? What is the source of that conflict? So I don't think it's bad to be there as fast as possible, but what you do then counts.
Let me just put some punctuation here. Yakov Leon is telling me that we have some tweets. Can I borrow your microphone for a second, Richard? And we'll give it to Yakov. What are people tweeting into this discussion?
Well, let's start with some really good news. Global Media Forum is among top 10 most discussed topics on Twitter. In this very moment, it's at number 2 in Germany. There's a lot of interesting tweets and posts. We have read at least 1,000, I think, so far. And here are just a few. Deutsche Welle represent human rights, democracy, and rule of law. Then Global Media Forum taking place in Old Parliament Building. We all feel like lawmakers. Apparently, a lot of people on social media were quite excited because of the red button we had here in the plenary hall and because of the launch of Deutsche Welle TV channel in English. Lots of pictures. Here's one quite entertaining tweet. Another normal day in the former Bundestag, but there's a big red button. The temptation to run and push is high. Or Global Media Forum is like a rock concert, but for media types. Referring to our panel discussion, Anuranda Sharma is asking, are journalists obsessed with violence and gore? Olga also tweeted an interesting question, how to deal with propaganda, fake news in Germany, referring to Russian media. Nyeri, if it bleeds, it leads, is justified as long as the coverage is representative of reality, our role in creating solutions, question mark. Another interesting thought, what do we do with audiences who only look for the blood in the news? No viewers, no money.
Okay, thank you, Yakov. People are complaining they can't find you on Twitter, Andreas. You're not on Twitter. They're looking for your Twitter handle.
I don't have a Twitter follow yet, and I don't intend to.
The gentleman who has the microphone, thank you for being patient. Where are you from?
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Efe Atio. I'm a Nigerian currently working and living in Tanzania. Over the years, Africans have felt very misrepresented and misreported by the international media. I mean, even if you go to journalism school, that's one of the first things that you're told. 2 people die in a bomb blast in somewhere in Nigeria, and it's big news. And yet people are dying every day. Hundreds of people are dying every day. So how do we make a choice, and how do we decide on what needs to be reported?
Okay.
I'd like to respond. I very much agree with your analysis in your first sentence that Africa is probably the by far most underrepresented and undercovered part of the world in the media. You can only change that by making an intentional decision to change it. The little paper I'm working for, die Tageszeitung Berlin, made this decision 10 years ago. We have approximately 50%, sometimes even more, of our whole foreign reporting devoted to the continent of Africa. We have a lot of correspondents there, not all fully employed because we don't have the money, but stringers, etc., more than any other print media and any other electronic media in Germany. But this is an intentional decision. Your colleagues who cover Asia, who cover the United Nations, who cover North America have to agree to, because they get much less space. I would dream that Deutsche Welle, with the limited resources it does have compared to the other big players, maybe makes a similar conscious decision to devote much more coverage to the African continent than, let's say, to Washington or the other familiar places.
Max Hofmann.
Yeah, I'm not the expert on our Africa program because I'm in Brussels, but I know that we have made exactly that decision with the arrival of our new general manager, Peter Limburg, and we do have a studio now in Nigeria, by the way. We have producers, stringers. We work with a lot of video journalists because we have come, obviously, to the same conclusion. And for a news channel that is broadcast in Africa and that has a lot of success, actually, by many standards in Africa, it was a necessity to do that, so we did.
Yes, and we've just also signed up Edith Kimani, who's our new correspondent in Nairobi, in Kenya. She, by the way, Andreas, has 130,000 followers on Twitter. Annika, you wanted to.
I'll just come in and say, I don't know why we continue sort of discussing this as if there wasn't anybody doing something about it. Denmark is a small country. DR is not the BBC, does not have the resources of the BBC. It's a small outlet after all. And they have had fantastic results with doing this. And mind you, constructive news is not telling just the positive story. It is actually trying to go one step ahead and do something and show the solutions. And maybe it's a small one. So, there are solutions. There are people who are trying to change what we are now talking about.
Perhaps I can just add at this point, you may remember in January this year, Arianna Huffington sent an email to all of her staff. They have a new, relatively new column which is called What's Working. And in that email, Arianna Huffington said, we want to show that the era of if it bleeds, it leads is over by relentlessly telling the stories of people in communities doing amazing things. These are the stories our readers are most interested in reading and sharing. Are the established media losing audience? And I'm talking about newspapers, I'm talking about the evening news. My son will walk out the room when the evening news comes up. Are we losing audience, that kind of audience, the audience of the future, because we are only covering doom and disaster? Max?
I don't think so. By the way, I still say we don't only cover doom and disaster. I'd like to maintain that. The complaints of the newspapers that they're losing people because they don't print as many newspapers anymore. I don't think that means that the audience necessarily disagrees with what the newspaper prints. I just think it's not up to date how people read their newspapers anymore. If it's a good and important story, if it's well researched, the journalist knows what he's talking about, and if you put it in a modern form, digitalized on a smartphone, if it's right there, you use social media then it's just as relevant as it was. The point is, though, that it's harder today because there's just so much competition out there.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to wrap up at this on that note. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to hand over back now to Brian Thomas, who'll just give you a few important bits of information before you break up.
Thanks so much, Christopher. A couple great questions coming up there. Very much. Thanks very much to our panel.